Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Leverage Flexible Learning to Support Safety Culture Change. My name is Cassie Bolter and I'm the Events and Partnerships Manager at Centus. Thibaut was unable to join us today, so in his place we are very lucky to have presenting for us today Centus Product Development Manager, Egan Barnett, who has more than 25 years in consulting, counselling, psychological assessment training and development. He has previously worked as a consultant psychologist across a range of clinical, forensic, return to work and organisational psychology casework, and product development specialist, Dr. Vanessa Thiele, with more than 13 years experience providing counselling, training and consulting to individuals and organisations across industry. Specialising in the design, development and delivery of training programs, Vanessa is an expert in resilience, health behaviour change, positive psychology and motivation and engagement. Just before we get underway, please note we're unable to hear you during the presentation, so if you have any questions, please enter them into the questions box and we'll address them at the end of the webinar. Thanks for joining us. I'll now pass over to Egan and Vanessa.
Excellent. Welcome everyone, and thanks for the intro, Cassie. We're certainly not a smooth talking Frenchman like Thibaut, but Vanessa and I work behind the scenes pretty closely with Thibaut and his colleagues, our principal consultants. So our role in the business is to assist organisations to customise their programs and to create meaningful solutions for our clients on the basis of their needs. We've learnt over time that there's lots of different client types, different participant types that we need to adjust our content to. So our role is to bring to life our vision and mission. So if you've ever been to a Centus webinar before or to a program, you'll know that our purpose is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better. And certainly that's the role that Vanessa and I play behind the scenes, is to make sure that the solution that we design is meaningful and hits the mark. The topic today is really close to our heart. So we have spent the best part of a decade looking at different ways that we can deliver our solutions. You'll know that we're pretty well known for our face-to-face delivery. Our consultants and facilitators are world class. But we also know that there's times where clients need something different in the way that we deliver that product. So that's what we're here to talk to you about today, is how we can actually leverage different types of learning that's not your traditional classroom-based face-to-face learning and provide different alternatives. So the way that we're going to unpack that today is to look at a couple of different approaches. So first thing we're going to do is take an umbrella approach to the current workplace training trends, just to put in perspective why we're talking about flexible learning in the first place. We then take a dive into what the best practice suggests in terms of adult learning and how that applies to workplace interventions. We'll give you a bit of an insight into what we've learned over the last decade or so with our flexible learning approaches, and then we'll give you some pointers in terms of how to set up for success. So that's our journey for the day. To get us started though, we thought we'd run a quick poll, and with this poll, I'll get Cassie to set that one up. What we're looking at here is really interested in terms of your organisational training. What's the portion of training that's currently being delivered by online, digital, or even flexible learning approaches? Is it most of it? Is it half of your training? It's sort of a 50-50 split. Are we looking at very little? Maybe you've dabbled in it and haven't really sort of seen much success, or you're just not touching it at all. So interested to see what people's responses there are. It'll give us a good baseline for the conversation today.
Give it one more second and then I'll close the poll.
Yeah, I'm interested to see where people are sitting on this. How much are you doing training currently, delivered online or digital formats?
Okay, I'll close the poll off now.
Thanks, Cassie.
Interesting.
Okay, so what have we got there? We've got almost half of it being a fairly strong. So okay, so we are seeing a bit of a a trend in that way. Probably no surprises given the current or the last couple of years, but certainly yeah, consistent with why we're having this conversation today. What we know, and Vanessa, I'll get you to jump in a minute because there's certainly some elements to this that are worthwhile comparing to that poll. Let's have a look at it at a really high level from a training perspective in general to start off with. So what we know is that training's getting a lot of focus, and certainly in the last 12 to 18 months, and the pandemic, and Vanessa and I really didn't want to talk about the pandemic as much as we needed to in this webinar, but we'll reference it. Is that we saw a bit of a roller coaster when it came to training. So we saw people pushing the pause button. We saw people, organisations actually taking advantage of the fact that they had people back in their back to their depots and whatnot to be able to do more training to fill some gaps that they may have had. We saw organisations bring a lot of training in-house to minimise external provider costs. And it's really starting to balance out now. So we know that the current global spend on training is around about the $350 billion mark. It's a little bit down from previously, but it's still a sizable contribution to the market. We also know that roughly 40% of the workforce upskilled in 2020. That was a significant increase from 2019, almost tripled it. We know that L&D professionals have identified that there's a skills gap. So there's a lot of upskilling and reskilling going on and planned to happen. If you unpack some of the areas where that upskilling and reskilling is happening, a lot of it is in digital literacy. And also we're seeing quite a large piece of that in diversity and inclusion training as well. Interestingly, prior to the pandemic, L&D was kind of on the outer when it came to the C-suite. It's firmly re-established itself as an important part of an organisation, and we're seeing a massive uptake in that. So why? Vanessa, why do you think this is sort of getting such an attention at the moment?
Well, there's probably a couple of reasons there. And first of all, there is a real need for training. So we're actually experiencing a bit of a global skills shortage at the moment. The large majority of companies worldwide, somewhere around 87%, are aware that they either have a skills gap issue now or they will have in the next few years. And this is fueled by a number of factors, including advances in automation, in AI technology, and a portion of the workforce falling behind the 8 ball when it comes to new tech innovations. So the other thing is that employees actually want to be trained. A 2019 LinkedIn Workplace Learning Report found that around 94% of employees say they would stay at a company longer if there's investment in their learning and development. So training provides a tangible impact on employee engagement and motivation. So people feel really valued when the organisation is willing to invest in their skills and development. And that results in greater work satisfaction and loyalty. Now, this is really critical because there's a bit of a war for talent at the moment. So we know that there's been high turnover rates because of the COVID effect. And, you know, so much so that some people are calling it the Great Resignation, right? So companies have to ensure that they pay attention to the needs and values of their employees if they're going to attract and retain the best talent. So, and you know, if high turnover rates has taught us anything, it's the importance of retaining that intellectual capital. So, you know, retaining that employee knowledge, skills, and experience is valued just as much as physical and financial assets. And it's really important if we're going to remain competitive. So we can see that there's real organisational need for training and employees really want that training. So, Egan, what can you say about how people's expectation of training has changed over time?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, if you pack it into those needs and wants, we're certainly seeing a lot of people wanting to increase their digital literacy. So there's a fair bit of appetite for that, both from the organisations and from the individuals. But in terms of how it's actually delivered, and this probably ties into some of that digital literacy appetite, is that people want training anywhere, anytime. So this is based on a study from Udemy, which is looking at the way that learners want to learn. So they want to learn anywhere, anytime. They believe that regular, frequent training is more important than a one and done. Sit down for a day and jam information through people. And they want training that's personalised and relevant. So, which is an interesting breakdown if you think about if that's the way that people want to learn. The way that we've traditionally trained, particularly in safety training and in safety culture training, has probably been almost the polar opposite in terms of get people in a room for a day or two, explore their attitudes around the culture, give them some skills around it, which is our traditional approach as well. But people are actually looking for more shorter, sharper, quicker, variable, flexible approaches. What we also know is that organisations appear to be putting their finger on the pulse with this, and that actually showed in the poll that we just did earlier. So when we look at actually the amount of investment that's going into digital learning, we're seeing a massive increase in digital learning solutions being implemented by organisations. A good portion are actually putting it into their budgets and planning for learning technologies to be a future part of their approach. More than that, they're having wins. So once they've implemented it, whether it was reluctantly or not, they either agree or strongly agree that they've been successful in those learning technologies. And the good part of that is that they feel as though they've had a win. They've broken through the ceiling a little bit in terms of innovating, maybe from a point of feeling stuck in the rut of the way they've been doing their training. This has kind of given them an impetus to change. And it shows. So in terms of the way that it's been broken down over the last year or two, we're seeing almost a three-way split. So the stand and deliver traditional approach still getting a reasonable amount of airtime, but the virtual classroom and the online technologies like your LMSs and open learning platforms are getting a fair whack of the approach. We know that a fair bit of that's been prompted by the pandemic and people's availability to be in a room together. So what we actually really want to know is what's going to happen next. And there's been some interesting studies on that. So it appears that digital is here to stay. So when asked whether, once the dust settles or we go back to that new normal, would you stay with remote or go back to classroom? Understandably, a fair proportion want to go back to the classroom training, but they don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you're looking at people, organisations wanting the option to have both classroom and remote learning, and few of those, so 8%, would stick to classroom only. And I'm sure that there's some contextual pieces to that in terms of the type of client or the type of participant and the type of content they're trying to train. So why do you think it's here to stay, Vanessa? I guess interested to hear from you what your understanding is of the drivers around that.
Well, companies aren't necessarily racing back to doing how they were doing them before, because there are some real benefits to maintaining remote learning. So first of all, we know that the accessibility and flexibility of remote training appeals to people's learning preferences these days. We have sort of an expectation now of more flexibility and doing things how we want to do them. Organisations also have opportunity to reduce some of the costs associated with booking travel and hosting travel. And it's also easier to reach remote and dispersed workforces. So we've worked with a lot of companies here and in NZ who have teams dispersed all over the country, and trying to get all of them in one place at one time for training, or getting people out to all these remote locations for training is, it's just astronomical. And there's also the carbon footprint to consider. So many companies these days are aiming to go paperless or to reduce their environmental impact. So remote training has some benefits there.
Yeah.
And of course, the real advantage is having agile and flexible delivery methods that allow us, it's kind of like having an ace up the sleeve.
May have lost Vanessa there.
We've lost your sound, Vanessa. If you want to maybe mute yourself and come back on again, and maybe we'll get you back.
While Vanessa's doing that, I'll just summarise that last point. So the alternative delivery methods, and we're seeing this a lot with our clients, is wanting either a fallback option if required, if the next sort of lockdown occurs, so that it doesn't interrupt the planning and scheduling, which again takes time, impacts on cost, impacts on planning, etc. So we are seeing the flexible delivery method or alternative delivery methods being requested as part of our scopes. So it would be a plan A and a plan B often, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, is some organisations are starting to realise that plan A works for one part of the business, but plan B works for another. Or they want to be able to provide both options and people can opt in to either one. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of progression that we're seeing in the way that training's been organised.
Can you hear me now?
Certainly can. Good stuff.
Right. Coincidentally, right when we're talking about having other ways that you can get around challenges and unforeseen things, there you go. Yeah.
I think that comes up in the lessons we've learned part a little bit soon, Okay, alrighty. So in terms of where we're at with that, we've summarised the, I guess the state of play at the moment with learning. Where we want to take it next is to expand the conversation in terms of if that's where we're heading with the idea that people are looking for flexible learning approaches, businesses appear to be looking for flexible learning approaches, then what are the best practices that underpin that? I know this is an area that's really quite close to Vanessa's expertise area, so she's done a fair bit of research in this area, and I'll throw over to you now, V, that you're back on air, to cover off on this best practice piece.
So when we're talking about best practice in this webinar, we're talking about it in the context of supporting a culture change program. And it's important to have that clarity because it might be different than the evidence-informed learning design for, say, an education program. So if we want to actually be shifting attitudes and behaviours and see a tangible impact on culture, then there's three key elements that need to be at play here. So firstly, there needs to be a clear motivation to change. So individuals need to see the training content as important and personally relevant for them. Then they need to have the knowledge of how to change and the confidence that they're able to practice the new skills and apply the knowledge that they learn in the training. And then the third element is there needs to be an environment that supports the change. So we tend to focus on the first two elements in our design and development of training, but the success of any learning engagement is really a 50-50 shared responsibility between the training provider and the client organisation. So we'll come back to that point a little bit later on and talk about how organisations can set up their training for success. But they're the three key elements for change, a change program. Let's have a look at the learning needs for participants. So we know that adults learn best when we adhere to these 5 key principles of adult learning. So first of all, as we mentioned before, it should be motivating. So the learner needs to have a clear understanding of the what's in it for me, or a perceived value of the training. The learning should be problem-centred. So people want to learn practical things that will help them to perform tasks or deal with challenges that they actually have to deal with in their work or in their lives. The learning should be experiential. So that means there's opportunities to practice new skills and learn by doing. And the learning should be relevant to current roles. So adult learners need to understand the so what and be able to make that leap from theory and models to how does this impact the things I do day to day and my current tasks. And then also the learning, as much as possible, should be self-directed. So, you know, humans have a huge need for autonomy, choice and control. So the more we can ensure that people feel respected and seen as capable by giving them choice and control over their learning goals and their experience, the better. So how do we incorporate these elements into learning methods? So there's 5 key ingredients here that we want to try and tick off. So this is what, you know, creates successful outcomes. So we know that good training these days is regular and frequent. So from a neuroscience perspective, learning experiences that occur in small bites over time give the brain time for reflection and consolidation and can be more effective than a one and done huge amounts of content in one go. That one can be something that organisations struggle to find a way to provide. So we understand that there are, you know, potentially some challenges around that one. Then we want to make sure that we're appealing to the emotional brain as much as possible. So facts and figures can be interesting, but they often don't stick or create those neural connections like making a personal connection or having an emotional connection to the content. So you'll know if you're familiar with our work, we use a lot of things like storytelling. We ensure that we connect the content to the things that really matter to the individual participants. And we've talked about the element of realistic practice and real world context, making it really relevant to the job. And training is more effective when there's opportunities for social learning. This is one that I think is really important when we talk about digital and remote learning. So social learning means there's opportunities for people to learn with and from other participants. So for instance, when we do blended learning, it might be that participants hop online and engage in some self-paced online content. And then they have an application webinar where they can, it's a live discussion, which could be face-to-face or remote. And they get to actually have discussions, breakout rooms, wrestle with problems, talk through different issues. And we've certainly noticed from feedback that many participants say that's the most useful and powerful part of the training. And we know that active engagement, when people are actively engaged in the training, making choices, decision making, or engaging in social learning, rather than being a passive recipient of the training, that definitely improves the quality and depth of the learning. And the final ingredient there, we've got gamification, is fun. You know, just because something is like safety training or leadership training doesn't mean it has to be dry and boring. The more we can make it fun and gamified, the more engaged and motivated people are. So these are the sort of key learning methods that really matter. I'm interested though, Egan, how much does the delivery method matter?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and probably that last point around the fun piece or the active engagement piece really does underpin the discussion around delivery methods. So what we're seeing is that often it's less about the delivery method and more about the user experience. And that goes the same for face-to-face as much as it does for blended learning or for online self-paced directed learning. You can have pretty poor face-to-face training as much as you can have boring, tedious, long online learning as well. So we're kind of putting the delivery method to the side a little bit for a minute, which is if you know what's going to work for your people in terms of the delivery method, the more important part is to make sure that the user experience of that method is effective. What we also know is that there's likely not going to be one solution that's going to suit your entire organisation, and that's probably been a shift for us over the years. Is that certainly, without giving too much away, been with Centres for quite a few years. When I started, it was a very much one product done well in one particular way. We've had to adapt. We've had to adapt, and we've had to be respectful that certain cohorts of a client's business may not be suited to just the umbrella approach. The other thing that, and this is the bit that's a little bit challenging, you alluded to it before, Vanessa, is that you actually may want to consider having dual delivery methods available for your participants. So it could be that you have exactly the same learning outcomes provided in a face-to-face delivery, and also have it provided as a flexible, bite-sized, self-directed consumption for different parts of your organisation, and it could be an opt-in. Now, that's not to say that there's an opt-out. You have to do one or the other, but they're potentially, and this is certainly where we're seeing some organisations are looking at, we'd like to have it, make it available for people who want to turn up to a face-to-face version, but we also, for those who are more visual or self-directed learners, give them that opportunity to do it that way. There'll still be a way to pull it all together and make sure people have actually consumed the content and understand it. But there's multiple different delivery methods, which is an interesting concept. So if we were to really sort of do a halftime summary of where we're at so far, what's the verdict, Vanessa, in terms of where we're at with this idea of flexible learning? So flexible learning being content that's delivered in multiple different modalities and generally available at the push of a button or at the time that you need it. Where are we how would we summarise where we're at?
Well, I guess the verdict is there's a few, high-level points here, and that is that overall online courses do seem to produce the same level of performance as face-to-face programs, according to a lot of the research out there. That said, blended learning, which is combining online learning that people might go through self-paced with a face-to-face learning element, or an opportunity to have that skills practice and consolidation afterwards, blended learning does perform better than standalone online learning, because you're making sure that people are translating that knowledge into skills and abilities. So then the other thing to consider is that technology-based training does create some time and budget efficiencies. And the fourth point is that, some learners will engage in technology-based training more easily, or they might have a preference for that over face-to-face. So we get some early adopters and some people that find they really appreciate the flexibility and the fact that they can drive it and all of that sort of thing, and they prefer it to over face-to-face. So I guess the verdict here is that online and remote learning are certainly real options worth considering for organisations wanting effective training.
Thanks, Vanessa. That's a good summary. Again, in terms of that blended learning performing better than face-to-face potentially, when you look at some of the data that's come from, there's a real stipulation around it being a like-for-like user experience as well. So again, if it's a really good face-to-face learning up against a really engaging and simple user-face-based blended learning, then that's when you start to see that the blended learning experience is starting to trump the face-to-face learning. Okay, that's probably a really good opportunity for us to start to look at, well, what have we learned? As I mentioned at the kickoff, we've been dabbling in the blended learning approach for well over a decade. And so, again, well and truly predating the pandemic. And a lot of that has been driven by either innovative clients wanting to try something different and change up their training approach, or clients who have recognised that dispersity of their workforce, or large-scale clients. So we've had some clients approach us in the 50 to 60, 70,000 employee sort of range. There's no way our traditional standard deliver model was ever going to be viable for them, let alone us. So there's been some times where we've looked at alternative approaches. So they've never gone away. They've always been there as options. So we just thought we'd unpack what we've learnt along the way. Here's a bit of a summary, and it's not an exhaustive list, but here's a bit of a summary of what we've actually used in the past. As I said, traditional face-to-face has been our bread and butter. Probably our first foray out of that was to go down the train-the-trainer line. So we pride ourselves on upskilling our consultants and facilitators to be world-class facilitators. So it was a little bit of a, I guess, letting the child leave the home type of situation for us to invite client trainers in to work side by side with us. And our initial approach was to really invest in those trainers from a client side as much as we invested in our own people, which was for us best practice to make sure we maintain the quality of the program, but a massive investment from the client side in terms of time and time off the job to prepare people from their end to stand and deliver side by side with our consultants. We've then started to see, we moved into the remote delivery phase. So webinar, our same program delivered via webinar over a platform like this. And that's been around for many years. It's been an option that we've used for probably some of our international clients where we haven't been able to get to them either in a timely fashion or they're just completely remote. So we've delivered via webinar. We've then started to create online learning modules. The first cab off the rank was plug and play induction modules that could slot into a client's induction LMS setup. More recently, we've really put a lot of eggs in the basket in terms of the blended learning approach. So this is where we provide some content online that's consumed at self-pace by the participant, and then we bring them back for an application session. And whether that's face-to-face in a traditional classroom or whether that's online with a webinar, that's been probably one of our more successful approaches. We have had a crack at mobile learning as well. So we've developed apps previously. Some of those were just-in-time type of learning apps. So they were short, sharp videos, explainer videos, small downloadable written content that people could have a quick look at. And they were soft skills type of things. So I'm about to go and have a conversation with somebody. What was that straight talking model that Centres talked about? And they could get that up on the app and refresh themselves. We did have a go at micro learning as well, which was more of a gamified and spaced learning approach, where you had an app, it pushed out content to you on a weekly basis for 4 to 5 minutes worth of information you had to sort of learn. Then you were tested on that through little pushed out questions that were gamified. And there was quite a big sort of competitive piece thrown into it with different departments competing with each other for who could answer the most questions and whatnot. So it was actually pretty sophisticated and well received, but very hard to maintain, but from both the client's end and to some extent our end as well. When you create a content like that, it's a hungry baby. You've just got to keep feeding it new content all the time. So what we found was that participants were that engaged that they were consuming the content at a rate faster than we could actually create and push it out. So it actually started to lose a little bit of momentum. And then we started to encounter tech difficulties. So a lot of this required people to be either on their own device or a work device that needed tech support at the client's end as much as we needed to maintain the platform at our end. But a pretty exciting project, that one that we worked on, and not saying that it's dead in the water. Probably we may have been a little bit ahead of our time with it. Mm. The other pieces, there are probably variations of what I've talked about before, which are the remote versions of train-the-trainer and co-facilitation. So you can see there's a bit of a list there. There's one not on the list that we're just about to release, which is more of an interactive video, so a bit of a choose your own adventure type of learning process, which is we're pretty excited about as well. So if they're the ways that we've approached things, the other thing we wanted to share with you was the types of, I guess, pushback that we hear, because it is a little bit scary to start to consider these types of approaches at times. So we do hear some interesting sort of concerns that get raised. So if we were to go and talk to a client pre-rollout and talk about, well, what's the delivery method options? The types of things we start to hear are, it's got to be face-to-face. We know that you guys are fantastic at delivering it in that way. We can't imagine it being delivered in any other format. Or they've once bitten, twice shy. They've had online learning that wasn't great, and so they've tried it before and it's boring. So not really sure that you guys are going to do any better. And you know, probably the other one we're seeing more now, and I'm sure this would resonate for people on the call, is people are getting online training fatigue. So not another webinar type of response, which is understandable and probably does also trigger that conversation around, well, how do we mix it up and provide different ways to do it online. There's a ripper on there that says, old mate Barry can't even open his Outlook mailbox, let alone do online training. And that actually was a real quote. Names have been changed to protect the innocent, but these are the kind of frames that people have around their users, that they won't get it, they won't want to use it, you know, they don't know how to open their mailbox. Probably the one there I think is really quite valid, and one that we spend a lot of time just trying to work through with our clients to support them on, is we get it, we get the flexible learning stuff, but logistically we just can't manage, you know, multiple touch points, multiple you know, getting people back for webinars, and particularly if you want to do them in incremental webinars, it's a hard thing to do. Easy to do if people opt in for it, because they're self-driven and want to put the time aside to come along to say a webinar series, or you know, jump on a forum and contribute to a discussion forum and then get onto a webinar. Harder to do if you're trying to get a blanket approach for a larger cohort and get them all across it in that way. And a real practical one there is that when we've come up against this is where people just don't have devices or even email addresses attached to their work approach. So we can't even push information out to them. So yeah, some interesting statements there. So Vanessa, there's probably a bit of a theme there around digital literacy, you know, access to digital equipment. What's your take on that in terms of the current way that we consume content?
Well, you know, there are some real genuine objections and some issues around digital literacy and that sort of thing. But just consider for a moment how we currently navigate our phones, for instance. So over the last few years, there's been a huge increase in the way we engage with games and apps on our phones. There's some stats there on the screen, but just think for a moment about the apps that you use on a daily basis. So there might be some banking apps. A little while ago, we had to do the coronavirus check-ins everywhere we went, Facebook, podcast apps, MyGov, you name it. So, you know, the fact is that online learning these days is becoming more and more intuitive and easier to just figure out how to use it. It's not like online learning 10 to 15 years ago. So I'd probably suggest that if you can navigate Candy Crush or Sportsbet on your phone, you're probably going to be able to interact with online learning.
Yeah, it's a really valid point, and I think this speaks to that digital literacy focus as well. As a lot of organisations are actually, you know, before you even getting to say the safety culture change process, would invest their energy in getting people up to speed with actually how to interact with their devices. but to your point, the interfaces that we can use now are very, very similar to the interfaces that people have been socialized with standard apps and smartphone, or even web-based apps, etc. Okay, I'll do a really quick sort of flick through what we've actually seen in terms of our feedback. So when we put our face-to-face feedback against our remote feedback over the last couple of years, what's really interesting is it kind of speaks to what we were saying before. We're seeing some very like-for-like feedback, some slight reduction in the remote, but not massive. And so if you were to overlay it to each other, there's benefits and costs of both. But certainly there's not a drastic difference between the two. So that kind of speaks a little bit to what the general research is saying as well. We're seeing that response in our own data as well. And in fact, we've had a really interesting case recently where a client worked with us graciously to actually trial a couple of different methodologies. So they were the type of client who'd done our program face to face, knew that it would always work that way. When we were asked to look at a webinar delivery version of that because of the pandemic, they did it. It was okay, but face-to-face was still better. Then we had an idea to let's have a go at another cohort going through a blended learning approach, and the response was, well, actually that was better than the face-to-face and the webinar in itself. So that to us shows that really we've if you're exploring this, you may want to explore a couple of different methodologies. Qualitative feedback that's come out of this also makes us scratch our heads sometimes. So we get the good with the bad. So we've had fun. It was definitely a better course than I've been to. Everyone was surprised that it actually was more engaging than they thought, through to people saying too much content, which is then balanced with people saying not enough content. So we get the whole range. So I just thought that was an interesting sort of share there to see that, again, the one size fits all is not necessarily the way to go. So to summarise that, the lessons we've learned is that best practice isn't always viable, and often the best practice research is based on traditional learning institutions like universities and schools. So we need to take that into just balance that a little bit with the way that best practice may not necessarily relate to practical for our clients. While good adult learning allows for self-directed learning, often our cohorts are told to be there and they rock up not knowing why they're there. And that speaks pretty strongly to how we communicate the rollout. There's no one or right solution, probably just a solution that's relevant to your operating context and cohorts. We know that user experience is the key. Probably a big question here is, are you looking for a training event or culture change? And our approach is to go culture change, but often there are times where the content and the information that needs to be delivered actually just needs to be done in a way that it's a training event and we don't get too caught up in the culture change process. We also know that digital change is scary. We know that ourselves, and we're adapting to it as much as our clients are. So it is something to go in with open eyes with. And as I mentioned before, we really want to pilot different options for large-scale transformations. And practically, once you get rubber to the road, you just need to be testing with the IT side of things so that the user experience isn't undermined by a technical glitch or a firewall or whatnot. So that's some of the lessons we've learned. We'll wrap this up now with some hints and pointers around how to set up for success. So Vanessa, I'll get you to jump in there.
Sure, so just a couple of things here. Think about, first of all, your organisation and your people. So consider things like accessibility and the language literacy and digital literacy of your people, and factors like, logistics and tech reliability, internet coverage, support you're going to need. While remote and online training can be just as effective as face-to-face, it certainly doesn't mean it's for everyone or every client. So that's why we generally consult with our clients to help them decide on what's the right approach for your people. Then you also need to consider the content. So it can be, if you've got things like compliance training, that a more educational approach, online delivery only, is quite effective. But if you're looking at that soft skills learning, so things like leadership capability and conversational skills, then that's when we need to have the element of skills practice, reflection and feedback. So this can be gained through that social learning element, or having coaching on the back of a learning rollout. So then you need to consider other elements that make the user element or experience stick. So, we take into regardless of what sort of training it is, whether it's online, face-to-face or blended, these are the basic instructional design principles that we need to incorporate. So if it's possible to make the learning contextualised around your organisation's values, your work context, language, the particular challenges or tasks that your people do, that makes a big difference. Having diversity of media, which is a mix of text, audio, video, that ensures that you sort of hit all of the learning styles and needs of the audience. Having good quality here, so the experience should be enjoyable, easy for people to navigate, keep them engaged, make them feel a sense of accomplishment as they go through. And having a simple user interface there, so there's a positive user experience. They're not bogged down in trying to figure it out. So all of these points really enhance the training transfer, ensures that the learning sticks. So we talked before, I sort of mentioned that it's a bit of a 50-50 responsibility between the client organisation and the training provider. How can the organisation set themselves up for success when it comes to a successful learning experience?
Yeah, as we sort of said before, we really want to put this in the context of a safety culture change process. So there's a lot that we need to be doing before the training even kicks off. And you mentioned before, linked to the strategy. So, is it a culture change or a training event? And how does that actually help you achieve your strategy? How does that link into your values? There needs to be some really strong pre-communication around the rollouts, and we still see that now, is that people are rocking up even to our e-learning approaches, and they still don't know why they're there. So there's some strong communication pieces that need to be tied into it. We'd also suggest that, if possible and relevant, train your leaders first, because they actually then start to become your change agents, particularly if it's a digital change that's involved in this process as well. So they can be out there sort of advocating that it was interesting, it was easy, it's not that hard to get on and do it, etc. That also ties into the post-training piece as well. A really big piece, whether this is delivered flexibly or otherwise, is plan your content integration during the contextualization and preparation phase. So if you know how the content's going to be used once you're back out in the field, you can start to be introducing that through the training phase. During the training, again, you want leadership sponsorship of the program. So if you can have people actually either so your leaders either doing a welcome video that can be slotted into an online learning piece, if you can have leaders opening programs or being present at the application webinar sessions, it just shows a really strong leadership support for the process. And obviously we've talked about the effective training design that needs to be integrated through the training user experience. After the training, coach and support your leaders. So again, they're more than likely going to be change agents and supporting the change down the line and the implementation of any of your process changes that might fall out of the training. So get them up to speed and support them along the way. Implement your content integration through your processes and systems. So it might be a different way that you approach, say, your pre-starts or a meeting, or the way you do your interactions in the field. So start to show the content coming to life in those processes. Run your campaign. So again, we know that training transfer drops off after time, so you need your little hits along the way to be refreshers and reminders and deeper dives into particular improvements that you're trying to achieve. And as I said, implement your refreshers. And this is actually, again, where flexible options come right in hand. So you can be having your refreshers delivered online or as standalone self-directed e-learning modules, or we can train the trainer to get your trainers or leaders up to speed to run those refreshers as well and hand the baton over. So there's a fair bit that's involved in the rollout there. Okay, well, that kind of wraps up what we wanted to share with you today in terms of the things we've learned and probably some hints and tips of if you are to go down the flexible learning approach. There's lots to consider. There are a lot of variables, and this is the types of things that Vanessa, myself, Thibaut, and the other principal consultants would work with you to help you sort of unpack along the way. So we'll start to wrap up with the next step being another quick little poll. And sorry, I've just lost my screen here. Bear with me, going so well. Let's get this on. So it looks as though the poll's gone up there. Sorry about this. Let's go there. There it is there. So what we're asking you is if you'd like to know more information in terms of the flexible delivery options that we've either run before or that are possible to integrate into your training solutions. So if you're interested in that, we'll get you to express your interest, and we'll be following that one up. Vanessa, before I finish off, is there any sort of final reflections from yourself?
No, I'm interested to see if there are any questions from the listeners.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here. I think you've covered this in sort of your last slide there, but when you put a case forward for training and people understand that it's needed, but nothing actually happens, the training doesn't actually happen, how can you help management see the benefits of why you kind of need the training or even the people attending the training?
Yeah, I assume that this is around that you're proposing the idea that, hey, flexible learning seems to be the go. It seems to be, you know, something that could work for our cohort. So some of it could be around presenting the data that we know that from a best practice point of view, it could work. The other piece is probably have a try, like maybe even, you know, get a trial up and running, get a small cohort, see whether it actually resonates, test your hypothesis. So if you think that maybe this flexible learning stuff might work, maybe get a piece of content that you might want to try and try in a few different ways, which is that case study I shared before is, you know, you might think webinar delivery is good, it might fall flat on its face. You might try your mobile learning apps. Just a word of warning there, pretty expensive to get up and running and maintain, but yeah, I guess part of it is building the business case with probably a little bit of data. Everything's pointing towards it, and maybe even finding an opportunity to road test it and prove your point. V, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I tend to approach things with a bit of curiosity. So if there seems to be some pushback around, you know, no, we don't want to go through that or we don't think it's viable, I'd wonder what's behind that. So maybe there's been a bad training experience in the past, or maybe there's some assumptions that this won't work or this is not right for our people. So I'd kind of investigate that and be a little curious. And sometimes we do actually have to build a bit of a case. And that's why, you know, we tend to really rely on the evidence and looking at, you know, the evidence and literature informed best practice, because then you can say that this works because of these reasons, or this is worth trying. Yeah, and sometimes it is just assumption, and it's if we can encourage people to have a bit of a play, have a try, often we find that those assumptions really change.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you for
point.
that. All right, next question is access and equity is a real issue in our organisation where non-cloud-based technology is preferred due to cybersecurity risks.
Yeah, that's the technical piece, isn't it? So we've come up against this in terms of firewalls and even we're providing content to the organisation so they can host it themselves. So often we work with some organisations who have, for national security reasons, very high security protocols. In those instances, we do not necessarily host the content ourselves. We provide it. So potentially that may answer a little bit of your question there. In terms of access, yeah, we've had similar situations where one part of the organisation went through the online learning piece, loved it, loved the blended learning approach, went to take it out to the next level or to another part of the business, and it fell flat. And again, that was the case where they actually didn't even have their own work email addresses or work devices. So there's probably some infrastructure piece there as well. If you're looking to go down the flexible learning approach, and we mentioned it earlier in probably some of the trends, is there's a lot of infrastructure spend going on to get up to speed with digital delivery. So that may actually be more of a budget and planning sort of conversation as well to address some of that accessibility piece. I hear the word accessibility and my head also goes to learning literacy and other pieces of accessibility that come into it as well. That then comes down to understanding your client cohort and developing the solution to meet that, so that potentially you've got an audio solution for a low literacy group versus it being more of an interactive reading and responding to questions on a screen. Not sure if that's the point of the question there, but there's probably some things we'd need to understand and work with you to address that. Vanessa, any sort of thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I just encourage, if you've got a bit of a complex situation like that, I'd really encourage you just to reach out and talk to our team. We've seen just about every, challenge pop up that can possibly pop up. So we're pretty good at figuring out ways to get around things. So the more clarity you can give us around your situation or the challenges or what the what the issues are, we can help you to think through how to make it possible.
Excellent. Next question is virtual reality training a viable option?
Oh yeah, that's the fun stuff, right? So we actually have and are looking into that. Is it viable? It's getting a lot more viable. So the wearable tech required for it is coming down significantly in price, and the development process of it. So we work with a studio that does VR and augmented reality development. They're actually the studio that we've just pumped out our interactive video with. The cost of developing it at their end is coming down as well as the tech improves. So it's definitely viable, really, really good for probably some of your so both your compliance-based training, so things like learning how to do an actual pre-start on a truck, through to virtual sort of leadership training. So having a conversation with another with an AI to learn how to have a difficult or challenging conversation with someone. So that's a really exciting space. It's not getting as much of the market share of the flexible learning approach, purely because right now the cost and logistics of it are still quite high, but it's becoming a lot more viable. And
Great.
if we had our way, we'd be in there, probably doing a bit more of it as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's our last question, and it's perfect timing because we're right at the end of our webinar. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us, and really thank you, Vanessa and Egan, for being our star presenters today. Everyone will be prompted with a very short survey, and we appreciate any feedback that you might have. So we encourage you to fill that out when it pops up when the webinar ends. And our next webinar is titled Operational Leadership and Critical Risk Management, and that'll be delivered on Thursday, the 28th of April. So we hope you can all join us then. Until then, stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.